So we're going to just touch on 3 subjects today. The key sort of architectural concepts, then we're going to move on to building designs, and then look at some of the key spaces that are emerging. Next slide. So apart from the newcomers, most people are versed in this version of the master plan. So WilKinsonEyre has been working on this for about 6 months. We've been working on creating the architecture. So our brief effectively is to create the best studio complex, one of high quality design. You know, when we came onto this, we were in an architectural competition to win it. So right from the outset, there was that notion that the client is striving for that high quality. What we're trying to do with the master plan is look and create a lot of visual interest, and we're doing that through the form of the buildings and the materiality. We also want to create points of interest throughout the master plan, and do that through clusters of amenities, and then create that sort of more human scale. Next slide, please. So this is some of our architectural references that we've been sort of using. So we've been exploring a lot of these industrial buildings that have pitched roofs and variety and variation within their facades and a sort of rhythm to them. Next slide. Again, with the materiality palette, I mean, we're looking at using all sorts of materials, but even when we've got sheet metals that we're going to be using, we're looking to create that rich articulated facades. Always do something interesting with the elevations. Next slide. So a lot of the buildings, by the nature of their uses, have very solid facades. And what we're looking to introduce is this translucency, to give that hint of what's going on behind while still giving the privacy that's required of these building typologies. Next slide. Again, we're also looking a lot at the colors and the materiality of the buildings. You know, we want things to sort of recede into the landscape and complement the greens and the local vernaculars that are around the area. Next slide. So this is a very, very small selection of some of the building evolution studies that we've been exploring over the months, looking at the materiality, the transparency, the colors, the roofscapes, the signage. Next slide. We're also looking to introduce, beyond the sort of the base color palette, is accents of color, and we want to use that for wayfinding within the project itself, as well as to break down the overall massing of some of the buildings. Next slide. So this is kind of the overview of the scheme. I mean, this is very much a working image, but it sort of encapsulates what we're trying to achieve. We are trying to sort of draw in the landscape into the project. We're trying to create a rhythm of the roofscapes around the perimeters of the site. We want to create as much green roofs as possible, have a lot of photovoltaics where we can, you know, really enhance the project.
And, you know, breaking down the massing is very crucial to the key views, and especially perimeter, having smaller buildings with pitch roofs that attenuates the visual impact from the perimeter and the long views as well. So it is absolutely of paramount importance for us to use that sort of gradient and having smaller building to those areas that are you know, more important, and positioning buildings that by their nature have a good level of activity throughout the development. That is also very key. And we are trying where possible, especially to the south where we have the public right of way, to articulate the buildings in order to follow the path. And that creates a continuously varying view that articulates the variety of the buildings even more.
We have the next slide. So I think what we're going to do, the next stage starts to touch on all the building typologies, and you guys might have seen these diagrams from the last presentation, but I mean, general principles are that the larger buildings are clustered around the center of the site, with the smaller buildings around its perimeter. Go to the next slide. I mean, so the sort of yellowy dots are the smaller of the building typologies, and the greener dots are the sound stages that sort of cluster towards the center of the site. Next slide. Next slide. So we're not going to show you every single plan because there's a few dozen building typologies to get through, but we're just going to go through some of the key types. And we're going to start with the dry stuff. So this is a typical plan of one of the sound stages, just so you understand what's going on. It's a very large open space. It's column free, has very large doors, so you can get in and out of it, assembled stage sets. It's predominantly a box that is soundproofed, and it's windowless, so it's a very controlled environment. Next slide. So again, this is just some of the typical sections through one of the typologies, and effectively the space on the inside, you have 12.5 meter clear space, and that's required so you can create those large sets, which are generally hung from the roof structure. The sort of, just to give you a notion of scale, the outside of this building is 17.5 meters tall to the top of the photovoltaics. Next slide. So we've got a few of the elevations that we want to show you. So this is one of the typical elevations to the sound stages, and we're still exploring colors and materiality, but the sort of the ones where, again, we'll come on to the views in the site in a bit, but looking at sort of the darker palettes because they very much complement the greens of the landscape. We're also looking to create the sort of accents of color to the sound stages. Again, one, to break down the massing, two, just to enrich it. Also, we're going to use it for wayfinding and signage. Next slide. So we do and will have the opportunity in places to actually draw in the landscape. You know, do you want to just go back 2 slides? Yes. So around the perimeter of the site, we do have these sort of planted buffers, and we're looking to enhance that further and draw in the landscape to engage with the building typology. So we are looking to create those planted elevations in places that we can do it. Next slide. So this is one of the internal elevations. It's very much what we're trying to do is, you know, we're overcladding again, the staircases all have to be external due to the nature of the buildings, but we're using that as an opportunity to clad them and create those moments of signage and wayfinding throughout the development. And we're also adding accents of colors to the doors. I mean, the doors are quite large, but you could imagine a Harry Potter train having to be taken in and out of the stage set at various points of a shooting. Next slide. So we're just going to touch upon the workshops and offices. There is a variety of different typologies, but they're all sort of the same. They fit the same program within it. And so the sketch here is an early study that Chris did. It's so the first 2 sort of bars is the workshop space, and that's where you'd build the sounds, the stage sets, and then the top floor of it is more of an office type space. Again, that's where stage sets would effectively be designed. And we're just looking at a variety of different articulations from the massing and the facades to, you know, enrich and break down the massing. Next slide. So this is the majority of the types. We've tried to reduce the quantum throughout the site, but still there is that variety that you have when you engage with the master plan. Do you want to go to the next slide? So again, just to start with the dry stuff, all the plans are very, very similar in terms of the office and workshop spaces. Again, they have similar size, large doors to the workshops again, so if you're creating a stage set in one of those spaces, you then need to take it out and put it into a soundstage for filming. So they're generally sort of more of a traditional grid of 6 by 9 meters, but some of the spaces are very, very large clear spans to allow for large stage sets to be built. Next slide. So again, this is just a typical section. So it's just showing the ground floor of the workshop spaces here. It's a floor to floor of 6.5 meters, and then the office space above that ranges in height from 2.1 all the way up to 5 meters. And what it does is it creates these nice loft style spaces. We look to maximize where orientation is relevant, create north facing skylights to sort of maximize our environmental strategies in places. Next slide. So we're just going to go through a few of the key elevations to the typologies. Again, these are very much work in progress, but you can kind of get the look and feel we're after. The ground floor facades are quite solid due to the nature of the activities that go in there. There's a clear story window around the perimeter of those spaces to draw in natural daylight, but we're also introducing into the sort of solidity of those facades where we can is translucency to sort of activate the ground plane and give that hint to the activity that's going on behind. We're also looking to encapsulate natural materials like timber where we can, just to give that warmth to the spaces that people inhabit. Next slide. So that it's a family of buildings that the materiality palette is generally with these ones are very, very similar. And it's more just orientation specific. So this one here, they're generally positioned on the side north-south, and that's to do with maximizing north-facing skylights. The one before was generally in an east-west direction where the north-facing skylights are not necessarily required.
And in those configurations, both of them, breaking down the massing also brings more like a sort of domestic feel to the buildings, which is very crucial. And if we go to the next slide, you see there's a similar way to break down the massing also for the flat roof buildings. We are still exploring materials. We have a more warm palette with timber in the first one, second with a different type of cladding. But in both configuration, the modular rhythm of the facade helps very much to downscale the size of the buildings. And if we go to the next slide, this is the flat roof with setback and is more HQ style of buildings. And again, we are using natural materials and articulate the various modules of the facade, again, in order to break down the scale of the buildings. And the floating roof as well helps very much to make the look and feel of the building much lighter. And terraces around the top floor also really enhance that connection between the more public and private realm. And for these buildings especially, we are trying to activate the ground floor, so you can have like sort of cafe in the squares that are really helping engaging with the public in certain specific location. For example, here this HQ is the one alongside the diagonal road that cuts across the site. So in key locations, we do want to have that more variety and of space, private and public. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, key spaces, next slide. So we are now highlighting a few of these key areas. Starting from the north, we have the access to the primary access to the site. If we go to the next slide, the aim is to have a nice piazza at the entrance where you can you welcome people in a quite wide environment, and the scale of the building, it doesn't go beyond 2-story. So again, very much a domestic height. If we go to the next slide, we see the entrance from the north. We're going to have a bus stop that directly faces the square, and all the activities at ground floor are very much related to the idea that we want to activate the ground floor around the entrance. And there's a car park to the left of the square, and in that location you have the entrance for a visitor, which can use the ground floor of the car park, and is kept separate to people working in the on the site, which have a separate entrance, so that we control the traffic as you enter. And if we go to the next slide, here you can appreciate how we are trying to make the space to feel like as democratic and as public as possible.
It's also worth saying, so this is one of the areas that, you know, where it's a semi-public sort of space, and there's an overlap here, and we very much want this to be as the massing itself breaks down towards the center of this space, as Michela's hinted at, which I think is very important, especially if this is a potential space for the future where there could be Sunday markets that could be hosted within this area. So it's a very active space. It's also worth just touching on, I mean, what we want to try and do is create these little moments throughout the project where, especially where the public come in to interact with it, that they see hints at what's happening and what has happened in the development. And, you know, just to the right of the image, we just sort of hinted at that. That's the reception building to the whole development, and we just dropped in a prop from Moonraker, but it's sort of an opportunity to have that overlap where people can actually see, you know, what's going on, and, you know, have those elements of excitement throughout the development. Next slide. So we just selected part of the right of way again. So just go to the next slide. You know, this was sort of very early days sketches of what we were trying to sort of introduce, the rhythm of the roofscape and the articulation of the facades and how that sort of looks within the landscape. Also looking to enhance the landscape zone around the perimeter. If you just go to the next slide. So again, this is very much work in progress, but the sort of look and feel of the public right-of-way is one to sort of enhance that natural aesthetic that we've got, and also to allow sort of glimpsed views into the development. I mean, we want to celebrate the architecture and allow people to enjoy that. Next slide. So this is just a quick snapshot of the access road to Westhorpe House and Homes. Go to the next slide. So again, I mean, we're working very closely with the landscape architects on this, and following their vision, but, you know, it's very much trying to enhance and enliven the road itself. Around where there's an interface with the building, we want to create those active zones, those active realms for people to enjoy, but we want it to look and feel quite natural, not sort of managed. Next slide. So again, this is just one of the views on the looking up, and it's adjacent to two of the sort of buildings with the setbacks, you know, and what we're trying to do, the road itself it has that sort of the natural hedgerows that are placed, but then behind it there's a little bit more public realm that can be accessed and enjoyed. So just touching on the studio hub. Next slide. So again, this is sort of early concepts where what we were trying to do is complement the office and workshop buildings. There's a rhythm to the workshops that we want to celebrate, and we want to bring that into what is a different typology. So we're looking to do that through the facades itself, you know, articulate them and create the setbacks that we're using elsewhere, one to break down the massing, but also to create that amenity and plant notions of zones of planting where we can get it. Next slide. So we'll come on to the plan in a second, but this is sort of, again, an early concept. The studio hub, it consists of 3 buildings to create this public or a semi-public space, but it's a space where events can happen. I mean, the whole studio hub is a crossover space between public and private. Next slide. So this is what the current arrangement is. As I said, it's a trio of buildings. The one on the left is more the media center. You know, the ground plane has screening rooms, breakout spaces for functions. The right-hand one is more sort of teaching and training facilities. So it has seminar rooms and teaching facilities within it. And again, it all sort of spills out onto a nice square, and what we're trying to do is sort of front the square with as much sort of, you know, bars and restaurants, or, you know, as we can to activate it. Next slide. So these, I must stress, are not verified views. These are just the views that we used to test the architectural appearance and what we feel responds best to the environment itself. So that they're very much a tool we use to sort of help us design the buildings. So
Elliot,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you just describe what is a verified view for those who don't know?
So a verified view is something we do for planning. It's a view that is taken from a location which is known to be very sensitive. And they're generally set up by a company which will do a view that is an accurate representation of the design. So it's done, I mean, us as architects, we don't do those sort of views, but what we do is we look to sort of test our designs within the views that are important. So if you can go to the next slide, we just got to zoom in. That sort of helps understand a little bit better, because I know some people are on a very small screen. And the color palette that we're trying to do is look for those natural reds, as well as the sort of the darker grays. And what we don't want to do, and what we feel was the wrong solution, is if you go a good building to look at, and this is there's a hotel on the hill at the back. It's quite a tall one and it's white, and it kind of stands out quite significantly, we feel. And what we're trying to do is make sure that the buildings recede into the landscape. I mean, these views at the moment, we haven't put in the landscape that's going to be added in between the building typologies. So this is just our tool at the moment, just to explore the color palette and how that sits in the landscape. We've got another one, I think, from Bloomwood. Again, you're going to have to zoom in to see it. So if you go to the next slide. Again, so you've got the A404 in the front, and then you can see the rhythm of the office and workshop buildings adjacent to it, with the sound stages in the background. And the building, the industrial estate to the right, or the business park, sorry. I mean, what we wanted to do is to make sure that it didn't stand out in the environment. So, I mean, that's the aim, and we're still exploring that material palette so we get it right. Next slide. That's it.